The night was quiet. Too quiet. A soft clank echoed from the garage, barely noticeable, but enough to wake Grandma. Her eyes opened immediately. Years of experience had sharpened her instincts. Something wasn't right. She didn't rush. Instead, she moved slowly, grabbing her cane, not for support, but for something else if needed. She crept toward the front window and peeked outside. The motion light had been triggered. Grandma's eyes narrowed. The garage door was open. Her heart pounded, but she stayed calm. Someone was inside. She shuffled toward the door leading to the garage, her old house slippers barely making a sound against the wooden floor. She pressed her ear against the door. Click. The unmistakable sound of a car door opening. Her grip tightened around her cane. She slowly turned the knob, easing the door open just a crack. Through the dim light of the garage, she saw a shadowy figure sitting inside her car. The silhouette was familiar. Then, the engine sputtered as the key twisted in the ignition. Grandma took a deep breath and stepped fully into the garage, her voice calm but firm. Going somewhere? The woman inside the car froze. For a second, neither of them moved. The soft glow of the garage light revealed the woman's face, one that Grandma recognized instantly. It was her. The HOA lady. The same woman who had been pestering them about the car for weeks. The one who had threatened fines, sent notices, and claimed that the car was an eyesore that needed to be removed. Now, here she was, inside their garage, trying to take it herself. Grandma didn't blink. The HOA lady slowly turned her head, her face pale. I was just. She stammered, searching for an excuse. Grandma took another step forward. The dim light highlighted the cold determination in her eyes. You were just what? Grandma said, her voice steady. The HOA lady swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel like it would save her. She glanced at the garage door, an escape route. But she wasn't fast enough. Grandma shifted her weight, lifting her cane just slightly. The HOA lady knew she had been caught. She wasn't going anywhere. And she had no idea that Grandma had been waiting for this moment. The garage was silent except for the faint hum of the car engine. The HOA lady, her name was Mrs. Thornton, sat frozen in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel. Her breath was shaky, her eyes darting around, looking for a way out. Grandma didn't move. She didn't have to. Her presence alone was enough. You were just what? Grandma repeated, her voice sharp and steady. Mrs. Thornton forced a nervous laugh. Oh. This is just a misunderstanding, she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. I was just checking on the car. You know, for safety reasons. Grandma raised an eyebrow. Safety? In my locked garage? Mrs. Thornton's fingers fidgeted on the steering wheel. Well, technically, the HOA has the right to remove vehicles that violate the guidelines. Your car has been parked here for months without moving, and we thought it was abandoned. Grandma took another step forward, tapping her cane against the concrete floor. Abandoned? I drive it every Sunday to church, and you've seen me do it. Mrs. Thornton's fake smile twitched. Grandma continued. And that doesn't explain how you got inside my garage. The HOA lady was out of excuses. She licked her lips and gave a weak shrug. I had a spare key. Grandma's eyes darkened. A spare key, she repeated. You mean you stole one? Mrs. Thornton's face turned red. Now, let's not use words like that, she said quickly. I'm just enforcing HOA rules. Grandma let out a small chuckle, but it wasn't a friendly one. That's interesting, she said. Because last time I checked, the HOA doesn't own my property. The tension in the garage grew thick. Mrs. Thornton was sweating now, her hands trembling slightly. Then, Grandma did something unexpected. She leaned down, reached inside the car, and pulled the key out of the ignition. Click. The engine shut off. Mrs. Thornton gasped. Hey, she snapped, her polite act disappearing. Grandma didn't flinch. She held up the key, turning it over in her fingers. I think I'll hold on to this, she said. And you? You're going to get out of my car. Mrs. Thornton glared at her, lips pursed in frustration. But she knew she had no choice. Slowly, she opened the car door and stepped out. Fine, she muttered. But I was going to tow it tomorrow anyway. The HOA has rules, and your vehicle is legally parked inside my garage, Grandma interrupted. Try towing it, and I'll have you towed away in a police car. Mrs. Thornton's face twisted with anger, but she didn't respond. She simply brushed past Grandma and stormed toward the open garage door. But just before she stepped out, she turned and hissed, "This isn't over." Grandma smirked. "Oh, I know," she said. And then, before Mrs. Thornton could say another word, Grandma pressed the button, and the garage door closed right in her face. The next morning, the family gathered in the kitchen, still in shock over what had happened. "She actually tried to steal the car?" asked the grandson, shaking his head in disbelief. Grandma nodded, sipping her tea. "She thought she could get away with it," she said. "But she made one mistake." "What's that?" Grandma smirked. "She underestimated an old lady with security cameras." The family turned to the screen where the footage from last night was paused, clear as day, showing Mrs. Thornton sneaking into the garage. The grandson whistled. "That's solid evidence." Grandma's eyes gleamed. "Oh, we're just getting started." Meanwhile, Mrs. Thornton sat in her house, seething. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from the HOA president. "We need to talk. I just saw the security footage." Mrs. Thornton's heart dropped. Things were about to get a lot worse for her. The next morning, Grandma sat at the kitchen table, sipping her tea, watching the security footage again. The proof was undeniable. Mrs. Thornton had broken into the garage. The grandson, sitting next to her, leaned forward. "So, what's the plan, Grandma?" She smirked. "We wait." And she didn't have to wait long. A loud banging rattled the front door. Bang! 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 The family exchanged glances. The grandson sighed. "Well, I guess we know who that is." Grandma stood up, taking her time walking to the door. She didn't rush for anyone, especially not thieves. She pulled it open. There stood Mrs. Thornton, her arms crossed, her face red with frustration. Behind her stood two other HOA board members, looking uncomfortable. "I need to speak with you," Mrs. Thornton snapped. Grandma smiled sweetly. "Oh, good morning. What can I do for you?" Mrs. Thornton scowled. "I've just received some unfortunate accusations against me," she said, forcing a fake smile. "Some people claim I'd broke into your garage, which is obviously a misunderstanding." Grandma nodded slowly. "Oh, of course. A misunderstanding." The HOA lady gave a stiff nod. "Exactly. So, I think it would be best if you deleted that security footage." Grandma's smile widened. "Oh, honey, that's not happening." The two board members behind Mrs. Thornton shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a man in his 60s, spoke up. "Mrs. Thornton, we need to be sure of what happened here. If there's video evidence, we should at least—" "There is no need," Mrs. Thornton interrupted sharply. "I was inspecting the property, like I always do." Grandma tilted her head. "At midnight? With a stolen key?" Mrs. Thornton clenched her jaw. "That car violates HOA rules. It needs to be removed." Grandma folded her arms. "And yet, you never sent an official violation notice. Instead, you tried to steal it." Mrs. Thornton took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Listen," she said, her voice lowering. "If you make a big deal out of this, it's only going to cause problems for you. The HOA has the power to fine you, revoke privileges, and—" Grandma cut her off. And I have the power to send the police straight to your doorstep. Silence. The HOA board members exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't going how Mrs. Thornton had hoped. Finally, the other board member, an older woman, spoke up. Look, we need to see the footage. If this is true, well, there are rules that even the HOA must follow. Mrs. Thornton turned on her, furious. Whose side are you on? The side that doesn't want a lawsuit, the woman muttered. Mrs. Thornton was losing control of the situation. Grandma stepped back and gestured inside. By all means, come watch the footage. The board members walked in, but Mrs. Thornton hesitated. She didn't want them to see it. But at this point, she had no choice. A few minutes later, the board members sat on Grandma's couch, watching the security footage in silence. On the screen, clear as day, Mrs. Thornton could be seen sneaking into the garage, unlocking the car, and trying to drive away. The man sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. Well, that's pretty damning. The older woman nodded. This is serious, Mrs. Thornton. Mrs. Thornton's face turned pale. I was just trying to do my job. The man scoffed. No, you were trying to steal a car. Grandma leaned in. So, what happens now? The board members exchanged looks. Finally, the woman sighed. We need to take this to the full HOA committee. Mrs. Thornton, we'll have to review your position on the board. Mrs. Thornton's eyes widened. Wait, you can't do that. Oh, we can, the man said. And if the police get involved, it's going to get a whole lot worse. Mrs. Thornton was trapped. Grandma smiled, sipping her tea. Told you this wasn't over. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thornton sat in her car outside, gripping the steering wheel in pure rage. Her career in the HOA was on the line. Her control over the neighborhood? Slipping. And worst of all? Grandma wasn't afraid of her. Mrs. Thornton clenched her fists. She wasn't going down without a fight. The air in the neighborhood felt different. Tense. After the HOA board members left, Grandma sat back in her chair, watching Mrs. Thornton storm off in anger. She's not done, Grandma muttered, setting down her tea. The grandson frowned. You think she'll try something again? Grandma's lips curled into a smirk. Oh, she's not the type to accept defeat. And Grandma was right. That night, something happened. The family had gone out for dinner, but Grandma decided to stay home. She didn't trust Mrs. Thornton. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Grandma sat by the window, watching. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., she saw it. A shadow moving across the front yard. She didn't react. She simply reached over, grabbed her cane, and stood up. The security cameras had already caught her in action, but Grandma wanted to see it for herself. She crept toward the garage door, pressing her ear against it. A soft click. Then another. Someone was picking the lock. Grandma's heart didn't race. She had expected this. She stepped back and waited. A moment later, the garage door creaked open, slowly, carefully. A dark figure slipped inside, moving quickly toward the car. And as soon as they stepped inside, Grandma flipped on the garage light. Click. Bright yellow light flooded the space. And there she was. Mrs. Thornton. Her hands were halfway to the door handle, caught red-handed. For a split second, she was too stunned to react. Then, her eyes darted toward the open garage door, her escape route. But before she could move, Grandma blocked her path. Going somewhere? Grandma asked, her voice as calm as ever. Mrs. Thornton's breath hitched. Her eyes flickered to the security camera in the corner. She had been caught. Again. She tried to recover. I was just, she stammered. Grandma took a slow step forward, tapping her cane against the concrete floor. Just what? Mrs. Thornton licked her lips. I was making sure your car wasn't a safety hazard. Grandma chuckled. Oh? And you needed to break in to do that? Mrs. Thornton clenched her fists. This car isn't allowed in this neighborhood. The HOA has rules, Anne. Grandma cut her off. Tell me something, she said, leaning on her cane. Is that why you brought this? She pointed to something on the floor, a small black device near the garage door. Mrs. Thornton's face went pale. The grandson, watching from the security feed inside, zoomed in. His jaw dropped. She brought a freaking signal jammer. That was serious. She wasn't just trying to steal the car, she had come prepared. Mrs. Thornton swallowed hard. I don't know what that is. Grandma smiled. That's funny. Because the security camera just saw you drop it. Mrs. Thornton's face twisted in panic. Listen, we can talk about this. Oh, we're not talking, Grandma said, stepping aside. Suddenly, blue and red lights flashed outside. The police had arrived. Mrs. Thornton's eyes went wide. Wait, no. You called the cops? Grandma chuckled. No, my grandson did. And as the officers stepped inside, Mrs. Thornton knew. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the garage, casting sharp shadows on the walls. Mrs. Thornton stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, her face drained of color. Two police officers stepped in. A tall man with a sharp gaze and a shorter woman with a notepad already in hand. They didn't look amused. The male officer's eyes landed on the signal jammer on the ground. His expression darkened. Ma'am, he said, looking directly at Mrs. Thornton, is there a reason you're inside this garage without permission? Mrs. Thornton opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The female officer didn't wait. She turned to Grandma. Did you call this in? Grandma nodded, crossing her arms. We have security footage of her breaking in. Again. Mrs. Thornton snapped out of her shock. This is ridiculous, she shrieked, throwing up her hands. I'm the head of the HOA. I have a legal right to enforce neighborhood regulations. The officers exchanged glances. The male officer knelt down, picking up the black device near the garage door. And does your legal right include carrying a signal jammer? Mrs. Thornton froze. The officer turned the device over in his hands. Do you know what this does? He asked, his voice dangerously calm. Mrs. Thornton stammered. I've never seen that before in my life. The officer wasn't buying it. He sighed, turning to his partner. Tampering with a signal jammer is illegal under federal law. It blocks security systems, garage door signals, even emergency calls. The female officer jotted something down. So she came here prepared to disable security and break in. Mrs. Thornton's voice pitched up. That's not true. This is a misunderstanding. Grandma smiled. Good thing we have security footage to clear it all up, then. Mrs. Thornton's face crumbled. The male officer nodded. All right, let's see it. A few minutes later, the officer stood in the living room, watching the security footage. The screen showed everything, Mrs. Thornton sneaking into the garage, fiddling with the jammer, and trying to start the car. The female officer let out a low whistle. That's clear intent to commit a crime. Mrs. Thornton's breathing grew ragged. This is outrageous, she suddenly screamed. I was only doing my duty. That car is against the HOA rules. The male officer gave her a flat stare. Even if that were true, you don't have the right to enter someone's private garage and attempt to take their property. That's called breaking and entering. Mrs. Thornton's fists clenched. I was just trying to enforce the rules. Grandma tilted her head. Then why didn't you go through the proper legal channels? Silence. The female officer sighed. All right, ma'am. Turn around. Mrs. Thornton gasped. Wait, what? The officer pulled out her handcuffs. You're under arrest for breaking and entering, attempted theft, and illegal use of a signal jammer. Mrs. Thornton sputtered. You can't do this to me. I'm on the HOA board. The male officer was unimpressed. You're also on camera breaking the law. Click. The cuffs snapped around her wrists. Grandma took a sip of her tea. Guess the rules apply to you too, huh? Mrs. Thornton thrashed. You haven't heard the last of this. The female officer smirked. Pretty sure we have. As they led Mrs. Thornton out the door, the neighbors peeked out from their windows, whispering. Word would spread. By morning, the entire neighborhood would know what happened. And Mrs. Thornton? She had just lost everything. The neighborhood was buzzing. By sunrise, the news had spread like wildfire. The head of the HOA, Mrs. Thornton, had been arrested. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks. Phones rang nonstop. HOA members held emergency meetings. Grandma sat on her porch, sipping her tea, watching the chaos unfold. She knew this was far from over. And she was right. That afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Grandma opened it to find two men in suits, lawyers. The older man adjusted his glasses. Ma'am, I'm representing the Homeowners Association. May we have a word? Grandma smirked. You mean damage control? The younger lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Thornton's actions were concerning. We'd like to ensure this doesn't escalate into a lawsuit. Grandma leaned against the doorframe. Interesting. And what exactly would a lawsuit reveal? The lawyers glanced at each other. The older one sighed. We'd like to offer a resolution. If you agree to drop the charges, we'll ensure Mrs. Thornton is permanently removed from the HOA board. Grandma chuckled. That's a start. But I have one question. The younger lawyer hesitated. Yes? Grandma's expression hardened. How many other people has she done this to? Silence. The lawyers shifted. That was it. The real problem. Mrs. Thornton had been on the HOA board for years. If she was bold enough to break into her garage, how many other homeowners had suffered under her reign? The lawyers remained tight-lipped, but Grandma already knew. She had seen too many mysterious violations, sudden foreclosures, and shady HOA fees. She turned, calling over her grandson. Bring me my laptop. The lawyers blinked. Excuse me? Grandma smirked. I think it's time we looked at all the HOA's records. Within hours, the neighborhood chat groups exploded. I had a fine for a lawn violation when my grass was perfectly trimmed. Thornton refused to show proof. I had to replace my mailbox, because she said it wasn't up to code, even though hers was identical. They tried to tow my truck twice for blocking the street. It was in my driveway. The list went on and on. The more people spoke up, the bigger the scandal became. By the next morning, a group of homeowners marched into the HOA office, demanding answers. Grandma, of course, was leading them. The HOA president, an older man with gray hair, looked pale. I had no idea she was doing all this. Grandma gave him a look. Didn't you? The president swallowed. We never questioned her reports. She handled the violations. She told us everything was by the book. The younger lawyer stood, rubbing his temples. This is bad. If homeowners sue, the HOA could face serious legal trouble. The president sighed. What do you want? Grandma smiled. Justice. By the end of the day, Mrs. Thornton was officially removed from the HOA. An emergency audit was ordered, uncovering years of fabricated violations, fake fines, and misused funds. Some homeowners received refunds. Others filed complaints. And Mrs. Thornton? She was banned from ever holding an HOA position again. That evening, Grandma sat back on her porch, watching the sunset. Her grandson grinned. You really took down an entire HOA board. Grandma sipped her tea. Just did what had to be done. The grandson chuckled. You think she's gonna try anything else? Grandma smirked. No. She's finished. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt peaceful. A week had passed since Mrs. Thornton's fall from power. The neighborhood was calmer. No more random fines. No more sneaky inspections. No more HOA dictatorship. And Mrs. Thornton? She had disappeared. Nobody had seen her since the day she was kicked out of the HOA board. Her house went dark, her car stayed parked, and the once bossy woman had gone completely silent. But Grandma? She wasn't done yet. One morning, the grandson walked into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Grandma, what are you doing?" Grandma was stirring a pot of soup. "Making lunch," she said. "For who?" She smiled. "Mrs. Thornton." The grandson nearly choked on his coffee. "What? You're bringing food to the woman who tried to steal your car?" Grandma chuckled. "I am." The grandson frowned. "Why?" She patted his hand. "Because when a person loses everything, you get to see who they really are." That afternoon, Grandma knocked on Mrs. Thornton's door. Silence. She knocked again. Finally, the door cracked open. Mrs. Thornton stood there, looking like a completely different person. Her hair was messy. Her eyes puffy from crying. She looked tired. She frowned. "What do you want?" Grandma held up the pot of soup. "Thought you might be hungry." Mrs. Thornton blinked, confused. "You brought me food?" Grandma nodded. "Thought you might need it." Mrs. Thornton hesitated, then slowly stepped aside. For the first time ever, Grandma sat in Mrs. Thornton's house. It was eerily quiet. No fancy decorations. No HOA files. Just an empty, lonely space. Mrs. Thornton sat across from her, staring at the soup in front of her. She didn't touch it. Finally, she sighed. "I lost everything," she muttered. "The HOA position, my reputation, the lawyers are still investigating me. I might lose my house too." Grandma sipped her tea. "I know." Mrs. Thornton laughed bitterly. "You must be loving this." Grandma shook her head. "No. I don't take pleasure in watching someone fall." Mrs. Thornton frowned. "Then why are you here?" Grandma set her cup down. "Because I think you forgot something important." Mrs. Thornton raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Grandma leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "That power doesn't make you strong. How you treat people does." Silence filled the room. Mrs. Thornton swallowed hard. "I thought I was helping the neighborhood. I thought I was in control." Grandma nodded. "And now that you're not?" Mrs. Thornton looked down at the table. "Now I have nothing." Grandma stood up. "Then maybe it's time to start over." Mrs. Thornton looked up, confused. "Start over?" Grandma smiled. "Being feared isn't the same as being respected. Maybe it's time you learned the difference." Mrs. Thornton didn't reply. She just stared at the soup, deep in thought. Grandma turned toward the door. But before she could leave, Mrs. Thornton spoke. "Thank you." Grandma paused, then nodded. "Take care of yourself." And with that, she walked out, leaving Mrs. Thornton with something she never had before. A second chance. As Grandma returned home, her grandson met her on the porch. "Well?" he asked. Grandma sat down, stretching her legs. "We'll see if she learns her lesson." The grandson raised an eyebrow. "You really think she'll change?" Grandma smiled, watching the sunset. "That's not up to me. But everyone deserves a chance to." The grandson nodded. "You're a lot nicer than me, Grandma." Grandma chuckled. "That's why I win." And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt at peace. The storm was over. And Grandma? She had proven, once again, that kindness is the strongest power of all. The end.